I am Nolan, and I am 32 years old. Exactly 4 days after we lowered my grandfather's casket into the cold earth, my own mother slid a 6-page legal document across her dining room table and demanded that I sign away my entire inheritance. While I was still exhausted, sitting in the very chair my grandfather used to occupy for our family Thanksgiving dinners, my mother looked me dead in the eye. "Sign it and leave," she said, her voice like ice. "You have no business being here." My older brother, the golden child of the family, laughed from across the table. "You don't need to understand any of this, Nolan. Just scribble your name and get out." They were mocking me. At the lowest point of my life, in front of the entire family, they thought they could humiliate me into submission. But there was one massive, catastrophic reality they were completely blind to. They thought I was just some low-level desk jockey making a basic salary. They had absolutely no idea that I am a licensed, aggressively successful probate attorney. And the fraudulent document they were trying to force me to sign was the exact weapon I was going to use to dismantle their lives and send them straight into a criminal courtroom. Before I tell you exactly how I tore their greedy little scheme apart piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe that toxic family members always get the karma they deserve. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment the illusion of my family shattered forever. The smell of my mother Beatrice's famous pot roast was usually the defining scent of my childhood home. It was the smell of Sunday dinners, of holidays, of false warmth. But that Tuesday evening, the heavy aroma of roasted meat and gravy just hung in the air, thick and nauseating. The dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. We had laid my grandpa Thaddeus to rest just 96 hours prior. The dirt on his grave had not even settled. I was still carrying the heavy, numb weight of grief in my chest. But apparently, the family business could not wait for tears to dry. My father, Harrison, sat staring intensely at his water glass, cowardly avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. My mother sat at the head of the table. Her posture was perfectly rigid, her clothes flawlessly pressed, her face set in that stony, arrogant expression she always wore when she was preparing to bulldoze over someone's boundaries. And then there was my older brother, Desmond, the undisputed golden child, the man who could do absolutely no wrong in my parents' eyes, currently leaning back in his chair with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. I had been summoned to the house under the pretense of discussing a few simple administrative matters regarding Grandpa Thaddeus's estate. No one had mentioned lawyers. No one had mentioned signing anything. I walked into that room expecting a conversation about funeral expenses or donating his old clothes to charity. My mother reached into a manila folder and pushed a thick stack of stapled papers across the polished mahogany table. She used 2 fingers, sliding it toward me with the kind of disdain you might use to push away a dirty napkin. "Sign it and leave," Beatrice said. Her voice was completely devoid of warmth, empathy, or even basic human decency. "You have no business being here." I looked down at the document resting inches from my hands, and then back up at her. I waited for the punchline. I waited for my father to intervene, to say something, anything to defend his youngest son. He just kept staring at the condensation on his glass, completely spineless. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Desmond let out a loud, obnoxious sigh, rolling his eyes as if my simple question was the greatest inconvenience of his life. "It's standard, Nolan. It is just a basic formality so Mom and Dad can handle Grandpa stuff without the state getting involved and taking a massive cut. Just sign the last page. You don't need to understand any of this. It is way over your head anyway." I did not reach for a pen. I reached for the document. I felt the heavy stock paper in my hands. My eyes naturally dropped to the formatting, the font, the structure of the clauses. I did not even have to try to translate the dense legalese. It was my native language. The header read, "Family Settlement and Consent Agreement." Below that, "Waiver of Objections and Consent to Administration." And there, buried deep in the middle of page 2, hidden beneath a mountain of intentionally confusing legal jargon, was a highly specific clause regarding a piece of commercial real estate located just outside the city limits. A highly lucrative property my grandfather had owned outright for 40 years. They were asking me to sign a blind waiver. By putting my name on that dotted line, I would be legally binding myself to accept whatever fake accounting they provided, and I would be expressly forfeiting my right to contest the transfer of that commercial property directly into Desmond's name. They wanted me to surrender my legal rights to an estate worth millions, and they wanted me to do it between bites of pot roast. If you are not a legal professional, reading a document like this is like trying to navigate a minefield blindfolded. It is designed by expensive lawyers to be intimidating. It is purposely structured to make the reader feel stupid, overwhelmed, and anxious, so they will just sign the bottom line to make the uncomfortable situation go away. But I am a lawyer. Specifically, I am a probate and estate attorney. I deal with contested wills, trust fund mismanagement, inheritance disputes, and family fraud every single day of my professional life. I handle massive corporate accounts, messy divorce settlements that spill over into real estate disputes, and custody battles over generational wealth. My family, however, never paid enough attention to my existence to actually know what I did for a living. To them, I was just a disappointment who worked in an office downtown doing paperwork. They never asked. I never offered. I am going to need a minute to read this thoroughly, I said quietly, flipping the page. My mother slapped her palm flat against the table. The silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. We do not have a minute, Nolan. Everyone else has already agreed to this. We are waiting on you. Your signature allows everything to move forward so we can finally grieve in peace. Stop being so difficult. You are always so difficult. If this is just a standard formality, I said, looking right into her angry eyes, then my signature should not be a life or death emergency requiring immediate action without review. Desmond leaned forward, his smirk vanishing into a scowl. Listen to me, you little punk. Grandpa just died. Mom does not need you turning this into one of your stubborn little tantrums. Our lawyer prepared it. It is done. Just sign the damn paper. Your lawyer prepared it, I repeated slowly. And your lawyer advised you to hand a legally binding waiver of rights to a beneficiary and explicitly tell him not to read it? He said things could be handled a lot faster if everyone just cooperated. My father mumbled, finally speaking up to defend the indefensible. I almost laughed, not because anything about this nightmare was funny, but because the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the situation was staggering. They were actively trying to rob me blind while I was literally wearing the morning suit I bought for my grandfather's funeral. I slowly closed the document. I tapped the edges against the table to align the papers perfectly. I placed it back on the mahogany surface. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally, I locked eyes with Desmond. Did Grandpa tell you guys? I started, letting the heavy silence stretch out just long enough to make the air in the room turn thin and unbreathable. That he called me 6 months ago. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Desmond's face went completely blank, the color draining from his cheeks. My father's head snapped up. Grandpa called you? Beatrice whispered, her voice suddenly entirely devoid of its previous arrogant command. About what? I pushed the document back across the table until it rested in front of her plate. I am not signing this today, I said. Or ever. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out the front door. I did not look back. But as I sat in my car and pulled out of the driveway, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My own mother, my own father, my own brother. They had absolutely no idea the kind of violent legal storm they had just invited into their lives. I thought the initial betrayal at that table was the worst part. I thought seeing their true colors was the ultimate heartbreak. I was so incredibly wrong. To truly understand how my family could sit around a dinner table and casually try to defraud me out of my inheritance, you have to understand the toxic, deeply unequal dynamic of the house I grew up in. I was the invisible son. Desmond was the golden child. It was never a subtle preference. It was a loud, undeniable, universally accepted fact of my daily existence. If Desmond got a B on a high school history test, my parents would take the whole family out to an expensive steakhouse to celebrate his brilliance. If I brought home a report card with straight A's, my mother would barely glance at it before reminding me not to get a big head because nobody likes a show-off. When Desmond turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new car with a giant red bow on the roof. When I turned 16, my father handed me a bus schedule and told me I needed to get a job bagging groceries at the local Walmart if I wanted to have pocket money. The disparity hit its absolute peak when it came to our college fund. My parents had proudly bragged for years about the joint college fund they had set up for both of us. But by the time I was ready to graduate high school, I received a letter from the bank. The fund was entirely empty. Desmond had blown through his half in 3 semesters of partying at a private university, and then my parents had quietly drained my half to cover his luxury apartment rent when he decided to drop out and find himself backpacking across Europe. I was devastated. When I confronted them, my mother told me I was being selfish for not supporting my brother's journey of self-discovery. I paid my own way through community college. I transferred to a state school. I worked brutally long night shifts as a security guard to afford my textbooks, and eventually, I clawed my way into law school using massive student loans. I did not ask them for a single dime. When I finally passed the bar exam, I thought they might finally be proud of me. I thought the achievement might earn me a seat at the table. Instead, my mother's only comment was, "Well, I hear those estate lawyers don't make much of a salary. I hope you can pay off all that debt you irresponsibly took on." From that day forward, they wrote off my career entirely. They never asked about my cases. They never asked about my promotions. They never visited my firm. Because I did not practice flashy corporate law or high-profile criminal defense, they assumed I was essentially a glorified notary public stamping boring papers in a windowless basement. But Grandpa Thaddeus knew. Grandpa was a sharp, fiercely independent, brilliant man. He built a highly successful hardware business from the ground up, invested wisely in commercial real estate, and never let anyone tell him how to live his life. He and I were close, but in a very quiet, unspoken way. We didn't have overly emotional talks. We talked about the stock market, home repairs, and the weather. He respected hard work, and he saw how hard I was working to build my life from nothing. That silent respect changed everything on a Tuesday afternoon in February, exactly 6 months before his heart finally gave out. I was sitting in my car outside the county courthouse, eating a stale sandwich between contentious custody hearings, when my cell phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed Grandpa Thaddeus. "Hey Grandpa, is everything okay?" I answered, expecting a question about a leaky faucet or his lawnmower. "Probably," he grunted. That was his usual answer. A single, gruff word that could mean absolutely nothing, or absolutely everything. He cleared his throat. The line was quiet for a moment, save for the sound of traffic passing by my car. "Nolan, let me ask you a hypothetical legal question, just between you and me. What happens if somebody signs a document, but later on, they aren't exactly sure what it was they actually signed?" I stopped chewing. My lawyer instincts instantly flared up. "What kind of document, Grandpa? A medical directive? A deed? Paperwork," he said vaguely. "Important paperwork." "That is incredibly helpful," I joked dryly. But he did not laugh. He went quiet for a long, heavy moment. Then, his voice dropped to a low, cautious whisper. "Nolan, can a person legally witness a signature on a document if they were not actually in the room when the document was signed?" My blood ran completely cold. The cheap sandwich felt like lead in my stomach. The implications of that question were massive. It meant someone was playing fast and loose with legal procedures regarding his assets. "Grandpa," I said, my brain clicking into high gear, shifting from grandson to attorney in a millisecond. "Does this involve Desmond or Dad?" Agonizingly long pause. "Maybe. Then I cannot be your lawyer," I told him, the words tasting bitter and painful in my mouth. "If there is a family dispute brewing, if someone in this family is having you sign things you do not understand, you need a completely independent attorney. Someone with zero ties to the family. It is a conflict of interest for me. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, he said, his voice trembling just a fraction. It broke my heart. I don't want to start a massive family war if I am just being a paranoid old man losing his memory. Age does something cruel to a person's confidence. You start wondering if a legitimate fear of being exploited is just a symptom of your own declining mind. You are allowed to ask questions about your own money, Grandpa. I told him firmly, refusing to let him doubt himself. You worked your entire life for what you have. You are allowed to protect yourself. I gave him the names of 3 powerhouse probate attorneys in the city. Men and women who did not play games and could not be intimidated. A week later, he sent me a brief text message. Went with Montgomery. Thanks. I never asked him what happened next. I wanted to respect his privacy. I assumed he had just updated his will, or perhaps clarified some banking details to prevent Desmond from accessing his accounts. I had no idea he was systematically preparing for a war. Now, back in the present day, the fallout from my absolute refusal to sign that waiver at the dinner table was immediate, coordinated, and vicious. By Thursday morning, my phone was blowing up. Relatives who had not spoken to me in 5 years were suddenly texting me, accusing me of tearing the grieving family apart. Aunt Fiona, my mother's younger sister, left a voicemail dripping with condescension. Nolan, I always knew you were deeply jealous of your brother's success, but trying to steal from your grieving mother during a funeral week is a new low, even for you. You need to apologize. Uncle Gideon called and tried a completely different tactic, playing the smooth peacemaker. Nolan, my boy, let's just smooth this over, all right? What kind of evidence do you think you have? You know your dad's heart condition cannot take the stress of a lawsuit. Just tell your old uncle what is bothering you. I did not reply to any of them. I knew exactly what Uncle Gideon was doing. He was fishing. He was trying to figure out what I knew so he could report directly back to my parents. They were terrified of the 6-month-old phone call I had mentioned. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cold cup of black coffee and ignoring the endless notifications on my phone, when a new email popped into my inbox. It was not from a family member. It was from Montgomery's law firm, the high-powered attorney I had recommended to Grandpa Thaddeus. The subject line was simply, Estate of Thaddeus Wallace Urgent. I opened the attached secure file. It was a certified copy of Grandpa's last will and testament. The very first thing I checked was not the distribution of assets. It was the date of execution. The will my family was relying on, the outdated will that the waiver was based upon, was dated 3 years ago. The document staring back at me from my computer screen was signed, witnessed, and notarized exactly 4 months before Grandpa died. He had changed absolutely everything, and my family had absolutely no idea they were operating on dead paperwork. The storm was about to make landfall, and my parents did not even have an umbrella. The very next morning, a bonded courier knocked loudly on my apartment door and handed me a thick, stiff legal envelope. It required my signature. I opened it to find a formal cease and desist letter from an attorney named Thorne. Thorne was exactly the kind of lawyer you hire when you know you are doing something highly unethical but want to make it look officially intimidating to a normal citizen. He was a strip mall attorney who handled everything from minor traffic tickets to messy, low-income divorces. The letter was an absolute masterpiece of legal intimidation for a layman, but an absolute, hilarious joke to a seasoned professional like me. It was full of aggressive, capitalized words threatening me with a massive civil lawsuit for tortious interference with the administration of an estate, and demanding I immediately sign the settlement agreement or face severe financial penalties and liability for attorney fees. I read it while leaning against my kitchen counter, actually laughing out loud in my empty apartment. The formatting was sloppy, the case law he cited was wildly out of date, and the core threat was completely baseless. You cannot legally sue a designated beneficiary for simply refusing to sign a voluntary waiver of their rights. It was a scare tactic, pure and simple. They were trying to bully me into submission before I could look under the hood of Grandpa's finances. They wanted me terrified. I tossed the letter in the trash can, picked up my keys, and adjusted my tie. It was time to meet the real lawyers. Attorney Montgomery's office was located downtown, occupying the entire top floor of a sleek, expensive glass building. There was no cheap wood paneling or desperate billboard advertising here. Montgomery was a silver-haired legal shark in a custom-tailored suit. When his receptionist ushered me into the massive conference room, Montgomery was not alone. Sitting next to him was a stern-looking, meticulously dressed man in his 50s with a thick stack of financial ledgers spread out in front of him. "Nolan," Montgomery said, standing up to firmly shake my hand. "I am very glad you came in today. Please sit down. This is Victor. He is an independent fiduciary and a certified forensic accountant." I shook Victor's hand, my mind racing through the legal implications. An independent fiduciary? Grandpa appointed an outsider to manage the estate. "Yes, he did," Montgomery said, gesturing for me to take the leather chair across from them. "Your grandfather came to me 6 months ago, extremely concerned. His primary goal was to ensure your mother was financially protected for the rest of her life. But he had serious, documented reservations about the recent financial transactions involving your brother, Desmond." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Desmond's logistics business." Montgomery nodded gravely. "Exactly. Over the past 3 years, roughly $250,000 flowed directly from your grandfather's investment accounts toward Desmond. Some were direct checks categorized as business loans. Some were structured transfers to cover Desmond's personal mortgage on his luxury condo, and some were massive, unexplained cash withdrawals. Grandpa always bailed Desmond out of his messes," I said, rubbing my temples as a headache began to form. "It is infuriating, but it is not inherently illegal for a wealthy man to give his adult grandson money." "You are correct on that point," Victor chimed in, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The older transactions were clearly authorized. Your grandfather complained about them bitterly in his personal notes, but he willingly signed the checks. The critical legal problem lies with the transactions from the last 8 months. Victor slid a thick, red folder across the polished table toward me. "Your grandfather," Montgomery explained, "began to suspect that highly complex documents were being put in front of him that did not match what he had verbally agreed to. He suspected his signature was being actively misused by Desmond and facilitated by your parents. Because of this profound breach of trust, he executed a completely new will 4 months ago. He completely removed your father and your brother from any position of authority over the estate." I felt a massive surge of vindication wash over me. Grandpa knew. He saw them for exactly who they really were. He didn't let them win. "So what happens now?" I asked, looking between the two men. "Now," Victor said, tapping his pen on the ledger, "I am conducting a full, independent forensic audit of the entire estate. Every penny will be accounted for. And according to the new trust provisions drafted by Mr. Montgomery, you, Nolan, have been legally appointed as the fiduciary overseer." I stared at him, completely stunned. The breath left my lungs. "Me? Why me?" Montgomery actually smiled. A thin, grim, deeply respectful smile. "Your grandfather's exact words to me were, 'Nolan is the only person in this entire family who does not need my money, and he is the only one who actually understands the law. He gave you the ultimate supervisory role over the trust. You do not manage the daily funds, but you have the absolute legal power to approve or reject Victor's final accounting, and the power to remove and replace the trustee if any foul play is discovered." A heavy, monumental silence fell over the conference room. My family thought I was a pathetic nuisance they could swat away with a threatening letter from a cheap lawyer. They had absolutely no idea Grandpa Thaddeus had essentially handed me the keys to the kingdom. "They don't know, do they?" I said quietly. "My parents, Desmond, they have no idea this new will exists. They are operating on the old one from 3 years ago." "Correct," Montgomery said. "And based on the highly aggressive letter you received from their attorney this morning, they are desperately trying to close the estate before anyone looks too closely at the commercial real estate transfers." I left the office feeling like I was carrying a loaded weapon in my briefcase. I had the power, but before I dropped the bomb, I needed to look my parents in the eye one more time. I needed to give them one last, final chance to come clean before the forensic audit destroyed their lives. I drove straight to their house. When I walked through the front door, the atmosphere was instantly toxic. My mother glared at me from the living room sofa, her arms crossed tight. My father wouldn't even look up from the television. And sitting comfortably in the armchair was Aunt Fiona. "Nolan," Fiona said, standing up and putting a dramatic hand over her heart. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you are here. Let's just talk this out rationally. Family is everything. We shouldn't be fighting." "I don't want to fight," I said, looking directly at my parents, ignoring Fiona's theatrics. "I just want to know the absolute truth. Why are you rushing this waiver? What are you trying to hide about the commercial property transfer to Desmond?" My mother stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "How dare you? You come into my home and accuse us of hiding things? Your brother needs that property to secure a vital business loan to save his company. It is what your grandfather would have wanted to help family. Did Grandpa sign the transfer, Mom?" I pushed, stepping closer. "Did he actually know what he was signing? Get out!" My father suddenly yelled, his face purple. "If you are not going to sign the waiver, get out of my house. You are dead to us." I looked at Aunt Fiona. She gave me a sympathetic, pitiful look, shaking her head. "Nolan, please. You are upsetting their blood pressure. Just go home. I will stay and talk to them. I will try to make them see reason. Trust me." I left, feeling sick to my stomach, but thinking that maybe, just maybe, Fiona could talk some sense into them before the legal hammer fell. An hour later, I was back in my apartment when my phone rang. It was Penelope, my brilliant, relentless legal assistant. I had asked her to do some background digging on the family's recent financial movements using the limited access Victor had granted us. "Nolan," Penelope said, her voice tight with anger, "I found something, but you are not going to like it. Just tell me, Penelope. I was running checks on the accounts linked to your brother's business. I found a wire transfer initiated this morning. $10,000. To who?" I asked, confused. "A vendor? A debt collector?" "No," Penelope said softly. "To Fiona, your aunt. The memo line just says, consulting." I dropped down onto my couch. The betrayal hit me so hard it physically knocked the wind out of my lungs. Aunt Fiona wasn't playing the peacemaker. She wasn't trying to help me. She had been sitting in that living room, pretending to be on my side, while secretly recording or feeding every single word I said back to my parents. She had sold me out for $10,000. My own blood, my own family, they were all in on it. Every single one of them was willing to stab me in the back to protect Desmond and his failing business. I closed my eyes. The hurt was unbearable for about 10 seconds. But then, the hurt burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard, razor-sharp fury. They wanted to play dirty. They wanted to use cheap lawyers, lies, and bribery to steal my grandfather's legacy and treat me like garbage. Fine. I would show them what a real lawyer looks like when he stops playing nice. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. I did not answer my mother's frantic, guilt-tripping text messages demanding I apologize to my father. I did not respond to Uncle Gideon's passive-aggressive voicemails telling me I was breaking my mother's heart. I completely ignored another blustering, poorly spelled letter from Thorne, the strip mall lawyer. Instead, I went to work. I essentially moved into a secure conference room at my law firm with Penelope. We worked late into the night, eating cold pizza, drinking terrible break-room coffee, and building an ironclad legal file alongside Victor, the independent fiduciary. We were preparing for a bloodbath. When you follow the money, the truth always reveals itself. And the truth about Desmond's highly praised business was pathetic. Desmond had started a high-end logistics company, bragging at every Thanksgiving dinner about his massive profit margins and impending promotions to regional contracts. It was all a complete fabrication. The company was drowning in massive corporate debt. He had grossly mismanaged client funds, lost his key contracts due to sheer incompetence, and taken out predatory, high-interest loans to cover his personal lifestyle. The leased luxury sports cars, the lavish European vacations, the expensive designer suits he wore to family events to look successful. When the business started to inevitably collapse, he went crying to our parents. And my parents, in their endless, blind, sickening devotion to their golden child, had financially ruined themselves to save him. They had liquidated their entire 401k retirement accounts. They had remortgaged their paid-off house. They gave him every single penny they had to keep his illusion of success alive. When their money completely ran out, they turned their greedy eyes toward Grandpa Thaddeus's estate. "Look at this," Penelope said one evening at 2 a.m., tapping a manicured fingernail against a printed bank statement. 3 days before your grandfather fell into the coma, there's a massive cash withdrawal, $50,000. But the signature on the authorization form doesn't match the signature on his standard checks from the exact same week. The slant is entirely wrong, and the pressure on the pen is too light. I stared at the paper under the harsh fluorescent lights. The signature was shaky, forced. "They were desperate," I murmured. "They tried to forge it themselves." But the 50 grand was not the kill shot. The kill shot was the commercial real estate property. Grandpa's commercial lot was located in a rapidly developing area. It was worth nearly $1.5 million. If Desmond could get that property transferred legally into his name, he could leverage it as collateral for a massive commercial loan to save his failing company and pay off his predatory lenders. Victor sent over the specific document my family had been trying to get me to sign away my rights to. It was a transfer of title. It bore Grandpa Thaddeus's signature. And below that, it bore a state notary stamp and a witness signature. The witness was my father, Harrison. I stared at my father's signature. What happens if somebody signs a document, but later on, they aren't exactly sure what it was they actually signed? Grandpa's voice echoed vividly in my head. Can a person legally witness a signature if they were not actually in the room? "Penelope," I said, my heart suddenly hammering wildly against my ribs. "Look at the exact date on this notary stamp." Penelope leaned over, adjusting her glasses, squinting at the blue ink. "October 14th. Pull up Grandpa's medical records from the hospital," I ordered, my voice tight. Keys clacked aggressively against the keyboard. A moment later, she turned the large monitor toward me. "October 14th. Your grandfather was admitted to the ICU for severe respiratory distress at 8 a.m. He was heavily sedated and fully intubated by noon. He never woke up. Look at the time stamp written next to the notary seal," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. 4:30 p.m., Penelope read. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God, he couldn't have signed this. He was unconscious with a tube down his throat in a hospital bed. They had forged it. Desmond had likely traced an old signature onto the deed, and my own father had knowingly signed his name as a witness to a complete criminal lie. But a forged signature is notoriously hard to prove in court without an expert, unless you can break the notary. A notary is a state-commissioned official. Their stamp is legally binding proof of identity and presence. If a notary stamped it, the law presumes the signer was physically there and of sound mind. I looked closely at the messy signature scribbled over the notary seal. "Silas Vance. Find Silas Vance," I told Penelope. "I don't care what it takes." Took us 2 days to track him down. Silas was not working at a reputable bank or a corporate law firm. He was working at a shady payday loan and check cashing center in a rundown strip mall, coincidentally, the exact same strip mall where Thorne had his cheap law office. I did not send a private investigator. I went myself. I walked into the dingy loan center on a miserable, rainy Thursday afternoon. Silas was a nervous-looking guy in his mid-20s, biting his fingernails behind a pane of scratched, bulletproof glass. I slapped my heavy, embossed law firm business card against the glass. "Silas Vance. My name is Nolan. I am a probate attorney investigating the estate of Thaddeus Wallace. I want to talk about a transfer of title you notarized on October 14th. Silas went completely pale. He literally took a step back from the counter, knocking over a cup of pens. I don't know what you're talking about. I notarized a lot of things. Hundreds of things. You notarized a highly lucrative real estate document for a man who was unconscious in an intensive care unit, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above us. That is not a clerical error, Silas. That is criminal fraud. That is a felony. That is state prison. He started to shake. I didn't know he was in the hospital. Attorney Thorne just brought the paperwork in. He said it was a rush job for a VIP client. Desmond was there with him. They told me the old man had already signed it at home, and I just needed to stamp it to make it official so they could secure a business loan. They gave me $500 cash. I swear to God, I didn't know he was dying. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him, but I finally had exactly what I needed. You are going to sign a sworn legal affidavit detailing exactly what you just told me, I commanded, staring him down. Or I am calling the district attorney from the parking lot right now. Silas broke completely. He gave me everything. That night, I sat alone in my dark apartment. The rain was lashing aggressively against the windows. I had the entire legal file spread out on my glass coffee table. The forged documents, the bank statements, Silas's sworn confession, the undeniable proof of my parents' financial ruin, and the new will appointing me as the overseer of everything. I picked up a framed photo of Grandpa Thaddeus from the end table. He was smiling, holding a fishing rod, looking out at a calm lake. You knew, I whispered to the empty room. You knew exactly what they were going to do. If I walked into the formal mediation room tomorrow and presented this file, there would be no going back. My golden child brother would face felony fraud charges. My father would face perjury and conspiracy charges. My mother would be publicly humiliated, utterly bankrupt, and exposed to the entire family as a manipulator. Aunt Fiona, Uncle Gideon, they would all be dragged into the unforgiving light of the truth. I would be destroying my own family. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, listening to the rain hit the glass. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners. I thought about the time my dad taught me how to ride a bike. I thought about my mom putting Band-Aids on my scraped knees when I was a kid. But then I thought about the look of utter disdain on my mother's face when she told me I had no business being in the family. I thought about Desmond laughing at me across the table. I thought about them draining my hard-earned college fund. I thought about them manipulating a dying old man to fund a lifestyle of absolute lies. They had already destroyed the family long ago. I was just the guy holding the mirror up to their faces. I carefully packed the documents into my leather briefcase. The brass locks clicked shut with a loud, final snap. I was ready for war. The morning of the formal mediation arrived with the kind of biting, unforgiving cold that cuts right through your winter overcoat and settles deep into your bones. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly because it felt like a lifetime had passed since that other Tuesday, the day my grandfather called me from his car to ask the question that unraveled our entire family. I drove downtown in absolute, suffocating silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not listen to my usual morning podcasts. I just listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of my car engine and felt the heavy, undeniable weight of the scarred leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat beside me. That briefcase was not just holding paperwork. It was holding the absolute, catastrophic destruction of my entire family, meticulously organized in red and blue legal folders, indexed, tabbed, and cross-referenced. We were scheduled to meet at 10 o'clock sharp in the primary executive conference room of Attorney Montgomery's law firm. This was not the dingy, poorly lit strip mall office situated next to a discount mattress store where my brother's cheap attorney practiced. Montgomery's firm occupied the entire penthouse level of a premier, ultramodern glass high-rise in the financial district. The moment you stepped off the private elevator, your shoes clicked against imported, highly polished Italian marble. The walls were lined with genuinely expensive abstract art and massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the sprawling city skyline below. It was a space meticulously designed by expensive architects to project absolute authority, undeniable wealth, and legal dominance. It was designed to make opposing counsel feel small before they even sat down. I arrived 20 minutes early. Montgomery and Victor, the independent forensic fiduciary, were already there. They were sitting at the far end of a massive, custom-built mahogany table that looked like it could comfortably seat a board of directors. They were reviewing the financial ledgers one final time in quiet, focused murmurs. We did not exchange pleasantries or make small talk about the weather. We all knew exactly what was about to happen. We were soldiers doing a final equipment check before walking onto a battlefield. At exactly 2 minutes past 10 o'clock, the heavy, frosted glass doors of the conference room swung open. My family walked in like they owned the entire building. My mother, Beatrice, led the pack, walking with the unearned confidence of a reigning monarch. She was wearing a sharply tailored, obviously new designer suit in a shade of deep navy blue. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, heavily sprayed into place, and she was carrying a luxury handbag she had undoubtedly purchased using the illicit funds she and my father had drained from their retirement accounts to keep up false appearances. She walked with her chin tilted up, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance and superiority. She did not look like a woman mourning the recent loss of her father-in-law. She looked like a woman arriving at a bank to collect lottery winnings. My father, Harrison, trailed slightly behind her. He provided a stark contrast. He looked intensely uncomfortable, wearing a drab gray suit that was at least a decade out of style, the lapels too wide, the shoulders sagging. He kept looking around the expensive, expansive room, his eyes darting from the artwork to the skyline to the polished table, clearly intimidated by the sheer wealth and power the environment projected. He looked like a man who knew he did not belong there. Then came Desmond, my older brother, the golden child, the man who had stolen my college fund and never looked back, strutted into the room wearing a flashy, custom-tailored Italian suit that screamed desperate new money. He shot his cuffs, revealing a heavy gold watch that was likely financed on a high-interest credit card, flashed $1 million, utterly fake smile at the receptionist who had escorted them in, and took a seat at the center of the massive mahogany table. He immediately spread his arms out wide, resting them over the back of the empty chairs next to him, taking up as much physical space as possible. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like a man who believed he had already won the ultimate victory and was just waiting for the referee to raise his hand. Finally, their attorney entered. Thorne. The man looked completely out of his depth from the second his cheap leather shoes hit the marble floor. His suit was slightly wrinkled at the elbows and knees, and he carried a battered, hard plastic briefcase that looked like it belonged to a traveling salesman from the 1980s. He took one look at Montgomery's flawless custom tailoring, the imposing, unsmiling presence of Victor, and the sheer scale of the room, and you could physically see the false confidence rapidly drain out of his body. He swallowed hard, adjusting his tie, and puffed out his chest, trying desperately to overcompensate for his obvious insecurity. They all took their seats across the vast expanse of the polished table. I sat directly across from them, completely still, my hands folded neatly over my closed leather briefcase. Beatrice locked eyes with me instantly. Her gaze was completely devoid of maternal affection, warmth, or even basic familiarity. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was the look you give a stray dog that has wandered onto your pristine lawn. "I am incredibly disappointed in you, Nolan," my mother said, breaking the heavy silence before anyone had even introduced themselves for the official record. Her voice was loud, sharp, and designed to cut through the quiet room. "Dragging your grieving, exhausted family into a sterile corporate office over a simple, ridiculous misunderstanding. Your grandfather would be absolutely disgusted by your blatant greed today. We should be at home mourning him, sharing memories, not sitting here dealing with your petty jealousy and your desperate need for attention." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not respond to the bait. I simply let her toxic words hang in the cold air, allowing the profound silence of the room to amplify her inappropriate outburst. Thorne cleared his throat loudly, trying to establish some semblance of professional control over his clients and the room. He popped open the latches of his cheap plastic briefcase and pulled out a disorganized stack of papers. "Well," Thorne began, using a pompous, overly theatrical tone that he probably thought sounded authoritative. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries. We are here today to officially and permanently finalize the estate of Thaddeus Wallace. My clients, Harrison and Beatrice Wallace, are the primary designated executors under the governing will. We have bent over backwards for weeks to accommodate Nolan's totally unfounded, deeply paranoid concerns. We have provided the family settlement agreement. All we require today is his physical signature on the waiver, so we can finally proceed with the lawful distribution of the assets, primarily the immediate transfer of the commercial real estate property to Desmond's Logistics Corporation, as the deceased clearly intended." Montgomery leaned forward, resting his forearms deliberately on the table. He looked at Thorne with the mild, detached amusement of a seasoned apex predator watching a wounded animal stumble blindly into a steel trap. "Mr. Thorne," Montgomery said smoothly, his voice a rich baritone that commanded instant respect, "just for absolute clarity on the official mediation record, are you formally entering the will dated 3 years ago into evidence as the governing document of this estate?" Thorne puffed out his chest again, sensing a challenge but completely missing the danger. "Absolutely, Counselor. It is the last known testament of Thaddeus Wallace. It has been filed. It clearly designates my clients as the sole executors with full, unmitigated administrative power. Nolan is a minor beneficiary entitled to a very small token cash stipend, which he will forfeit entirely under the contestability clause if he continues this frivolous, harassing delay tactic. We are fully prepared to file a massive civil lawsuit against him for tortious interference with an inheritance if he does not sign that waiver before we leave this room today." The threat of a lawsuit was a calculated move. It was supposed to make me flinch. It was supposed to trigger my self-preservation instincts and force me to capitulate. My family watched me closely, waiting eagerly for the fear to register on my face. Desmond actually smirked, leaning forward to pour himself a glass of sparkling water from the crystal pitcher in the center of the table. "Just sign the paper, little brother," Desmond said patronizingly, swirling the water in his glass. "I have a massive corporate promotion to secure by the end of the month, and I need that property cleared to finalize a major supply chain expansion. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You do not understand how high-level real estate capital works. You just push paper. Leave the heavy lifting and the business decisions to the adults." I looked at Desmond. I looked at the perfectly tailored suit he bought with money he had effectively stolen from our parents. I looked at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of a man who had built his entire adult life, his entire identity, on the broken backs and empty bank accounts of our parents, and was now actively trying to steal the legacy of a dying old man to cover his own catastrophic failures. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire body. It was the absolute, crystalline clarity you only feel in the heavy, silent moments right before a massive storm breaks. The anxiety was completely gone. The hesitation was eradicated. I reached down and unclasped the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic snap echoed loudly like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the emotional hysteria my mother had displayed. "You are currently holding a dead document. You are aggressively attempting to enforce a will that was legally, completely, and irrevocably revoked 4 months before my grandfather passed away." Thorne stopped talking mid-breath. His mouth hung open slightly, his eyes darting between me and his paperwork. My mother let out a sharp, mocking, utterly dismissive laugh. "What on earth are you talking about? You are losing your mind, Nolan. There is no other will. We handled all of his affairs. You are just making things up to drag this out." "Actually, Mrs. Wallace," Montgomery interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the full, crushing weight of his legal authority. "Your son is entirely correct. Thaddeus Wallace came to my office in person 6 months ago. He expressly revoked the document Mr. Thorne is currently holding. He executed a completely new will, drafted personally by my firm, and placed the entirety of his liquid and physical assets into a highly protected, irrevocable trust. The color drained from Beatrice's face in an instant, leaving her pale and ghostly. Desmond's glass of water stopped halfway to his mouth, his hand trembling slightly, causing the ice cubes to clink against the glass. Harrison practically sank into his chair, looking like he had just been physically struck. "That is a lie," Desmond snapped, his voice suddenly losing its smooth, arrogant edge and turning shrill and panicked. "Grandpa would have told us. He trusted us. My dad is the executor. We hold the legal power of attorney. You had the medical and financial power of attorney," Victor stated flatly, opening his massive ledger for the first time, the thick pages turning with a heavy thud. "That authority was completely stripped from you and your father 4 months ago due to documented, highly suspicious financial exploitation. I am Victor. I am an independent forensic fiduciary. I am currently in complete, total control of the Wallace estate. And we are not here today to ask for Nolan's signature on a fraudulent waiver. We are here today to conduct a formal, legally binding audit of your extensive, criminal financial activities." The steel trap had officially violently closed. They had walked into that room expecting a total surrender. They had walked in expecting to bully the invisible son one last time. They were entirely unprepared for a slaughter. The silence that followed Victor's brutal declaration was absolute and deafening. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick, sound-absorbing carpet. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out through the ventilation system. Thorne was the very first person to panic. He scrambled through his disorganized papers, his hands visibly shaking, knocking over his own pen. "This is highly irregular. This is an ambush. We were not formally notified of a new will through the probate court. If this new document actually exists, we will contest it immediately. We will file for a full medical competency hearing regarding the deceased. My clients had a long-standing, well-documented verbal agreement regarding the commercial real estate. Desmond requires that exact property to secure capital for his business. We have a signed, legally binding transfer of title executed prior to his death." Thorne desperately reached into his briefcase and slammed a single document down on the center of the mahogany table. It was the forged deed, the golden ticket, the singular piece of paper my family was desperately depending on to save Desmond from total financial ruin and public humiliation. "This transfer was signed in black ink by Thaddeus Wallace," Thorne declared, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his professional footing. "It legally transfers the commercial lot fully and in perpetuity to Desmond Wallace. It is formally witnessed by Harrison Wallace, and it bears the official registered stamp of a licensed state notary public. It is an ironclad legal transfer of real estate. You cannot simply undo this transaction, regardless of whatever new, secret will you claim to have conjured up." Desmond leaned back in his chair, a sickly, desperate, terrified smile returning to his pale face. "Exactly. Grandpa signed the property over to me. He wanted me to have it. It is a done deal. You guys are wasting your expensive hourly rates on this." I looked down at the document sitting alone in the middle of the table. I looked at the shaky, clearly forced signature of the man I loved and respected more than anyone else in the world. I looked at the witness signature of the father who had betrayed his own blood. I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I buttoned my suit jacket. I walked around the edge of the massive table, my footsteps echoing softly, until I was standing directly across from my brother and my parents. I picked up the transfer of title and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the perjury and the fraud embedded in the paper fibers. "A signed document," I said softly, almost thoughtfully, "witnessed by my own father, notarized by a commissioned state official. Read it and weep, Nolan," Desmond sneered, though the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his bravado. "You lose. Again." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my own blue folder and placed it deliberately, perfectly aligned, next to the forged deed on the table. "This," I said, raising my voice so it carried clearly and sharply to every corner of the large room, "is the official, time-stamped, legally certified medical admission record from St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. It clearly dictates that on October 14th, the exact calendar date written in blue ink on this transfer of title, Thaddeus Wallace was admitted to the intensive care unit via emergency transport at exactly 8 a.m., suffering from massive, catastrophic respiratory failure. My father gasped loudly, his hand flying to his mouth as if he had been punched in the stomach. I pulled a second document from my folder and slammed it down flat onto the table. This is the attending physician's official intubation and sedation log. I continued, my voice gaining momentum, turning into a relentless, pounding hammer of truth. By 12 p.m. noon on October 14th, my grandfather was heavily sedated with propofol, completely unconscious, and breathing entirely through a mechanical ventilator tube inserted down his throat. He never woke up from that medically induced coma. I picked up the forged deed and thrust it directly toward Thorne's face. Look at the timestamp written in the notary block right next to your official seal, Mr. Thorne, I commanded, my voice dripping with pure legal venom. Thorne looked down at the paper. He started sweating profusely, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as he realized his career was essentially over. It says 4:30 p.m., I stated loudly, making sure the court reporter who was silently transcribing the mediation got every single syllable. At 4:30 p.m. on October 14th, my grandfather was completely unconscious in a hospital bed with a machine breathing for him. So please, Attorney Thorne, explain the legal mechanics to me. Explain to me how exactly a comatose man held a ballpoint pen and signed this commercial real estate transfer. Beatrice looked at her husband in absolute, paralyzing horror. Harrison? What is he talking about? You said Thaddeus signed it before the ambulance arrived. You said it was fine. Harrison was completely frozen, locked in a state of catatonic shock, staring at the table like the paperwork was going to burst into flames. They forged it, Mom, I said, looking directly into my mother's wide, panicked eyes. Desmond traced Grandpa's signature from an old Christmas card, and Dad, out of blind, pathetic loyalty to his golden child, knowingly and willingly signed his name as a sworn witness to a completely fraudulent document. He committed perjury. That is slander, Desmond yelled, standing up so quickly his heavy chair scraped violently against the floor and tipped backward. You cannot prove anything. The notary stamped it. The state recognizes the notary. It holds up in a court of law. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a thick, legal affidavit bound with a heavy blue backing. This is a sworn, notarized criminal affidavit from Silas Vance, I said, dropping it onto the center of the table with a heavy thud. He is the notary you paid $500 cash to in a dirty strip mall parking lot. Silas has formally, legally confessed to stamping this document without the signer physically present, at the direct, coercive instruction of Attorney Thorne and Desmond Wallace. He has already submitted a verified copy of this confession to the district attorney's office in exchange for immunity. Thorne physically recoiled from the table as if it had electrocuted him. He grabbed his cheap briefcase, didn't even bother closing the latches properly, and began violently shoving his loose papers inside. I was actively misled by my clients, Thorne shouted, his voice cracking in sheer panic. I was told the signature was completely valid. I was told the signer was at home. I am formally withdrawing my legal representation of the Wallace family effective immediately. Do not contact my office. Thorne did not even wait for a response from Montgomery or his former clients. He practically sprinted out of the conference room, the heavy glass doors swinging wildly and banging against their hinges behind him. The silence that replaced the fleeing lawyer was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The grand illusion of the perfect, respectable, wealthy family had just been completely, violently, and permanently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. You ruined us, Desmond whispered, staring at me with wide, crazed, panicked eyes. His chest was heaving. My company is bankrupt, Nolan. If I do not get that commercial property to secure the bridge loan by Friday, I lose absolutely everything. My investors will sue me. You ruined my life, Nolan. You ruined your own life, Desmond, I replied coldly, feeling no sympathy, no guilt, no remorse. You grossly mismanaged your corporate funds. You lied to your private investors. You drained Mom and Dad's entire retirement accounts to fund your luxury cars and your vacations. And when you ran out of innocent victims, you tried to steal from a dying man who had already given you too much. Beatrice suddenly stood up. Her arrogant, monarch-like posture was entirely gone. She looked incredibly small, desperate, and deeply terrified. She reached across the massive mahogany table, her manicured hands trembling violently. "Nolan, please," my mother begged, her voice cracking, completely devoid of pride. "Please, sweetheart, we can fix this. We can keep this inside the family. Just talk to Mr. Montgomery. Tell him to drop the forensic audit. We will tear up the deed right now. We will burn it. We will let you have your fair, equal share of the inheritance. We will give you whatever you want. Just do not let them send your brother to a federal prison. You are a brilliant lawyer. You know exactly how to make this paperwork disappear. Please, Nolan, do this for your family." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire 32 years on this earth making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the woman who had coldly told me to sign away my fundamental rights and leave her house just a few short weeks prior. I looked at the woman who had drained my college fund to pay for Desmond's European backpacking trip. "I cannot do that, Mom," I said, my voice completely steady, anchored in absolute reality. "Why not?" she pleaded, dark mascara tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup, ruining her pristine image. "You are his brother. You share the same blood." Montgomery stood up slowly, buttoning his custom suit jacket with meticulous precision. "Because Mrs. Wallace," Montgomery said, delivering the final, fatal, magnificent blow, "Nolan is not just a standard beneficiary. Under the incredibly strict terms of your father-in-law's new irrevocable trust, Nolan has been legally appointed as the fiduciary overseer of the entire estate. He possesses the absolute, unquestionable final authority over the distribution of every single asset, down to the last penny. He is the ultimate legal guardian of Thaddeus Wallace's legacy. He could not make this disappear even if he wanted to, because I answer to him." I stood there and watched the profound realization hit them like a freight train. The son they had mercilessly discarded, the career they had consistently mocked as a joke, the intellect they had intentionally ignored for 3 decades. I was now the absolute, undeniable master of their total financial fate. "Grandpa knew exactly who you all were," I said quietly, packing my devastating documents back into my leather briefcase. "He gave me the ultimate legal power to protect his legacy because he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was the only person in this room who could not be bought, could not be manipulated, and could not be bullied. The forensic audit will proceed as mandated by law. Every single stolen dollar will be accounted for." I snapped my briefcase shut. It was the loudest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The total collapse of my family was not a slow, graceful decline. It was a sudden, violent, public implosion that left absolutely no survivors in its wake. Following the disastrous, explosive mediation session, the independent forensic fiduciary, Victor, moved with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. The forensic audit uncovered exactly what we knew it would, and then it uncovered even more. Desmond's highly praised logistics company was nothing more than a hollow, decaying shell built entirely on massive predatory debt and fraudulent accounting practices. To avoid immediate federal criminal charges for the forged real estate document and wire fraud, Desmond was legally forced to sign an ironclad restitution agreement under the threat of prosecution. He had to completely liquidate his entire company, selling off his corporate assets, his client lists, and his equipment at rock bottom, embarrassing prices just to pay back the stolen funds directly into Grandpa's trust account. Within 3 agonizing weeks, the bank repossessed his leased luxury sports cars from his driveway in broad daylight. A month later, his expensive, ultra-modern condo in the city center was formally foreclosed on by the bank. But the ultimate, most devastating blow came directly from within his own home. When the undeniable truth about his massive hidden debts his failing business, and the impending criminal fraud investigation came to light, his wife, a woman who had married him for his perceived wealth and status, immediately filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce. She hired a shark of a divorce lawyer. She took full, exclusive custody of their 2 children, citing his extreme financial instability, his deceit, and his severe criminal exposure as a direct danger to the children's welfare. The golden child, the man who had been handed the world on a silver platter since the day he was born, was left with absolutely nothing but a cheap rented apartment and a mountain of legal bills. My parents, incredibly, fared no better in the fallout. Because they had willingly and secretly liquidated their entire 401k retirement fund, drained their savings accounts, and taken out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on their home to secretly fund Desmond's failing business venture, they were completely destitute. When Desmond went bankrupt, they lost their only source of theoretical repayment. They were forced to sell my childhood home, the house with the beautiful dining room where they had tried to steal my inheritance, just to cover their outstanding debts and narrowly avoid declaring personal bankruptcy. They had to pack up 30 years of memories and move into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment on the dusty outskirts of the city. The social and familial fallout was equally brutal and deeply humiliating. In a large, extended family that thrived on toxic gossip and judging each other, dark secrets rarely stay hidden for long. Aunt Fiona, the woman who had sold me out for $10,000, actually tried to visit me at my law firm a few weeks after the mediation had concluded. She walked into the pristine reception area carrying a large, cellophane-wrapped basket of expensive gourmet muffins, wearing her usual fake, overly sweet, perfectly practiced smile. "Nolan, sweetheart," Fiona said, her voice dripping with artificial affection as I walked out to the lobby to meet her. "I just wanted to check on you. The family is in such absolute turmoil. Your parents are so lost, so broken. I just want to be here to support you through this incredibly difficult, tragic time." I looked at her, standing there in her expensive clothes, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no betrayal, just a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. "I appreciate the grand gesture, Fiona," I said, speaking loudly enough for my receptionist and 2 waiting clients to hear clearly. "But I think your emotional support is heavily conditional and highly overpriced. Did you bring the muffins today to earn another consulting fee? Or did my parents simply run out of $10,000 wire transfers to buy your loyalty and your espionage services?" Fiona's face dropped as if the muscles had been severed. The fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, deer-in-the-headlights panic. She turned bright, unnatural red, dropped the heavy gift basket onto a waiting room chair, and practically ran out of the office lobby. She never tried to contact me, call me, or text me again. Uncle Gideon, the great peacemaker and moral compass of the family, immediately and publicly cut all ties with my parents to protect his own pristine reputation in the community. He stood up at a family Thanksgiving dinner, one I did not attend, and publicly condemned Desmond as a criminal, claiming he had always known Desmond was a fraud and a liar. They all turned on each other like starving wolves the absolute second the money disappeared. It was a pathetic, tragic, deeply ugly display of exactly what happens when familial relationships are built entirely on financial dependency, toxic favoritism, and mutual deception. For the first time in my entire 32 years of life, I did not feel the crushing, suffocating need to step in and fix their problems. I did not feel the overwhelming, programmed urge to shrink myself down to make them comfortable. I simply stood back and let them face the severe, unavoidable, completely natural consequences of their own deeply selfish criminal actions. I took my rightful, legally protected share of my grandfather's inheritance and invested it wisely in index funds and real estate. But far more importantly than the money, I took the ultimate, profound lesson my grandfather had given me in his final months, and I used it to completely rebuild the entire foundation of my own life. 6 months later, the heavy, oppressive, suffocating weight that had sat squarely on my chest for my entire conscious life was finally, permanently gone. I used a portion of my grandfather's inheritance to officially leave my old corporate law firm and open the doors to my own independent legal practice. I chose to specialize exclusively in elder law, estate protection, and high-conflict probate litigation. I dedicated my entire professional career to protecting vulnerable older adults from the exact kind of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and family exploitation my grandfather had suffered. My new business exploded almost overnight. There is, unfortunately, a massive, endless demand in this country for attorneys who actually care deeply about protecting the elderly from their own greedy, entitled children. I also started attending intensive weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Eris, a brilliant, compassionate trauma specialist. I spent hours sitting on the comfortable couch in her quiet, sunlit office, meticulously unpacking 30 years of emotional neglect, the profound pain of being the invisible son, and the immense, lingering guilt I initially felt over ultimately destroying my family structure. "You did not destroy the family, Nolan," Dr. Eris told me softly during our 10th session, handing me a tissue as I recounted the mediation room. "The rot was already there, deeply embedded in the foundation. Your parents and your brother built a house entirely out of lies, theft, and favoritism. You simply refused to let them lock the doors and burn you alive inside of it. Setting a firm, unyielding boundary is not an act of destruction. It is an act of profound self-preservation and deep self-respect." Her words became my daily mantra. I learned, slowly and painfully, to accept that I could not change my parents. I could not force them to love me the way they unconditionally loved Desmond. But I realized I could absolutely, totally control how I allowed them to treat me moving forward. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the funeral, my receptionist buzzed my private office line. "Nolan," she said hesitantly, her voice low, "your father is here in the lobby. He does not have an appointment. He asked if you had 5 minutes." I paused, setting my expensive fountain pen down on a legal pad. I took a deep breath, centering myself. "Send him in." Harrison Wallace walked into my office slowly, his posture defeated. He looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him paralyzed in that mediation room. His shoulders were severely slumped. His gray suit was frayed at the cuffs, and he looked incredibly tired, hollowed out by stress. He stood awkwardly in front of my heavy oak desk, refusing to meet my eyes. "Nolan," he said, his voice raspy and thin, "your office is very nice. You've done well for yourself." "Thank you, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, calm, and professional. I did not stand up. I did not offer him a seat. He shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. "Your mother and I... Things are very hard right now. Desmond won't even speak to us. He blames us for losing the real estate property, saying we didn't hire a good enough lawyer. We had to sell the house, Nolan. We are living in an apartment. We have almost nothing left for retirement." He paused, clearly waiting for me to step in, to offer financial help, to open my checkbook, to fall back into my old programmed role of fixing their catastrophic messes. "I am sorry to hear that you are struggling financially," I said firmly, my voice unwavering. "But you made your financial choices. You chose to fund a failing business. You chose to sign a fraudulent document. I cannot fix those choices for you." He looked down at his scuffed shoes. I know I did. I wanted to come here to say I am sorry. About the waiver. About the witness signature. I was just trying to help your brother succeed. I wasn't thinking. You were fully willing to let me lose my rightful inheritance, and you were fully willing to commit a state felony, to cover up his continuous failures. I corrected him gently, but with absolute terrifying finality. An apology, no matter how sincere, does not erase that reality. I forgive you, Dad. Truly, for my own peace of mind and my own soul, I forgive you. But I do not trust you, and I cannot, and will not, have a relationship with people I do not trust. He nodded slowly, tears welling up in his tired eyes and spilling onto his wrinkled cheeks. He turned around without another word and walked out of my office. It broke my heart a little bit to see him like that, so broken and defeated, but I knew with absolute certainty that if I gave them an inch, if I opened the door even a crack, they would eventually take everything from me again. I had to protect my peace. 10 minutes after he left, my next appointment arrived. Mrs. Higgins was a fragile, sweet widow in her late 70s. She walked into my office clutching a faded plastic Walmart grocery bag tightly to her chest like a shield. She sat down across from me, her frail hands trembling as she pulled a massive, completely disorganized pile of bank statements, confusing insurance policies, and legal deeds out of the bag and placed them on my desk. "My son told me not to worry about any of this," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice shaking with deep anxiety. "He keeps bringing me complex papers to sign. He says it is for my own good, so the state does not take my house to pay for taxes. But I don't understand the words, Mr. Wallace. I don't understand what I'm signing, and I am so afraid he's going to put me in a home." I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. I thought about Grandpa Thaddeus sitting alone in his car, making that cautious, fearful phone call to me in the dark. I smiled warmly, leaning forward and resting my hands gently on the desk. "Well, Mrs. Higgins," I said gently, my voice full of reassurance, "I am going to have to heavily disagree with your son. We are absolutely going to worry about the paperwork. We are going to sit here and read every single line together, page by page, until you understand it perfectly. And I promise you, as your attorney, no one is going to make you sign anything you do not want to sign." The profound, immediate relief that washed over her wrinkled face, the way her shoulders instantly dropped, was worth more than any corporate salary I had ever earned. I had finally found my ultimate purpose in life. On the crisp, beautiful afternoon of the 1-year anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The leaves on the massive oak trees were turning brilliant, fiery shades of gold and red. I stood in front of Grandpa Thaddeus's polished granite headstone. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of a single page from my grandfather's private memorandums, given to me by Montgomery after the estate was completely settled. I unfolded the paper and read the familiar, messy handwriting. It was a note he had written to himself the day after he called me. "Called Nolan today. He told me not to sign anything I do not completely understand. It is very good advice. I just wish I had taken it sooner. That boy is a good lawyer. He is a good man." I smiled, the cool autumn wind rustling the leaves around me. "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered into the quiet air. "I understand the assignment." For a very long time, I used to describe this entire nightmare by saying, I never told my family I was a probate attorney, but standing there in the quiet cemetery, I realized that wasn't actually accurate. I had not actively hidden my career from them. They had simply been too incredibly self-absorbed, too busy worshiping my brother, to ever ask who I was or what I did. And if I am being perfectly honest with myself, I had helped them underestimate me. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down, deciding that correcting their insults was too exhausting, and making myself incredibly easy to overlook because being invisible was the only way to keep the false peace in a highly toxic home. I was never, ever doing that again. Being the quiet, reasonable person in a family does not mean you have to volunteer to be the person everyone is allowed to dismiss, manipulate, and abuse. If you have ever had someone mistake your quiet patience for total submission, you probably understand exactly why this lesson changed the entire trajectory of my life. Sometimes the most vital, life-saving thing you can possibly do is read the fine print before you sign your name. And that does not just apply to legal documents. You have to read the fine print on the people sitting across the table from you, even if they share your blood. Thank you for listening to my story. It is not an easy thing to expose the darkest, ugliest corners of your own family to the world. But I shared this because I know I am not the only one. I know there are thousands of you out there who are the invisible child, the one who does everything right but is constantly sacrificed to protect the golden child. I want you to know that your peace is worth fighting for. Setting a boundary with toxic family members does not make you a bad person. It makes you a survivor. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to legally or emotionally stand up to the people who were supposed to protect you? Share your story in the comments below. Let this be a safe space for us to heal together. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, protect your peace and always read the fine print.